Unfortunately, the aftermath of George Floyd's death has produced a second challenge to the rule of law. While many have peacefully expressed their anger and grief, others have hijacked protests to engage in lawlessness, violent rioting, arson, looting of businesses and public property, assaults on law enforcement officers and innocent people, and even the murder of a federal agent. Such senseless acts of anarchy are not exercises of First Amendment rights. They are crimes designed to terrify fellow citizens and intimidate communities. As I told the governors on Monday, we understand the distinction between three different sets of actors here. The large preponderance of those who are protesting are peaceful demonstrators who are exercising their First Amendment rights. At some demonstrations, however, there are groups that exploit the opportunity to engage in such crimes as looting. And finally, at some demonstrations, there are extremist agitators who are hijacking the protests to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. We have evidence that Antifa and other similar extremist groups, as well as actors of a variety of different political persuasions, have been involved in instigating and participating in the violent activity. And we are also seeing foreign actors playing all sides to exacerbate the violence. The Department of Justice is working to restore order in the District of Columbia and around the nation. Here in Washington, we are working with the local police, the citizen soldiers of the National Guard, and other federal agencies to provide safety and justice. We have deployed all the major law enforcement components of the department on this mission, including the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, the Bureau of Prisons, and the U.S. Marshal Service. Their leaders are with me today and we'll be talking shortly. I thank all of these leaders and their components for working bravely and professionally to protect the district. I'm pleased to say that, especially over the last two nights, the demonstrations, while large, have been peaceful. The Justice Department is also working closely with our state and local partners to address violent riots around the country. Our federal law enforcement efforts are focused on the violent instigators. Through the FBI, U.S. attorneys' offices, component field offices, and state and local enforcement, we are receiving real-time intelligence, and we have deployed resources to quell outbreaks of violence in several places. I urge governors and mayors and other state and local leaders to work closely with the National Guard and with us. The federal government has thus far made 51 arrests for federal crimes in connection with violent rioting. We will continue to investigate, to make arrests, and to prosecute where warranted.
A couple of very good questions for you, if I may. Yesterday, the department charged 3 members of the group, or associated with the group Boogaloo, a far-right extremist group, known as a far-right extremist group. Is it important in your remarks and thoughts to point out all the different groups that are involved in this type of violent activity? And then the second question is, do you have any concerns that law enforcement could have perhaps been more surgical in how they operated on Monday? And many of the people who were moved forcibly were peaceful protesters, sir.
Well, I do think it's important to point out the witch's brew that we have of extremist individuals and groups that are involved, and that's why in my prepared statement I specifically said, in addition to Antifa and other extremist groups like Antifa, there were a variety of groups and people of a variety of ideological persuasion. So I did make that point. I'm not going to get too specific, but the intelligence being collected by our U.S. Attorney's Office is particularly integrated by the FBI from multiple different sources is building up. There are some specific cases against individuals, some Antifa related. A lot of the extremists are involved in egging on violence and participating in violence, providing the means of violence. We are pursuing those cases. At the same time, there's a lot of, I would also add, there's a lot of disinformation out there, people posing as different, as they're members of the different groups. So you sometimes have to dig a little deeper to determine exactly what's going on. There are some groups that don't have a particular ideology other than anarchy. There's some groups that want to bring about a civil war, the Boogaloo group, that has been on the margin of this as well, trying to exacerbate the violence. So we are dealing with, as I say, a witch's brew of a lot of different extremist organizations. Maybe Chris would have something to add to that.
Sure. I mean, let me say first, as I've said for quite some time, and including even my first few months in the job, we, the FBI, have quite a number of ongoing investigations of violent anarchist extremists, including those motivated by an Antifa or Antifa-like ideology, and we categorize and treat those as domestic terrorism investigations and are actively pursuing them through our joint terrorism task forces. In the course of the current unrest, while the majority of the protesters are peaceful, there are certainly instigators, agitators, and opportunists seeking to exploit these demonstrations to commit violence or rioting. And exactly who these people are, who's driving them, what tactics they use varies widely sometimes from city to city, sometimes even from night to night. And we're working with all of our law enforcement partners to gather as much information as we can about that topic and to bring federal charges where appropriate and possible. So we're about the violence. We're not about the ideology. And it doesn't matter what your ideology is. If you commit violence or rioting or acts that we would consider terrorism, we're going to pursue it.